The candles in Blackthorn Manor burned a deep amber that night. Every chandelier dripped with light. Every corridor smelled of pine and warm wax. Hundreds of guests in silk and velvet filled the grand ballroom, their masks hiding their faces, but never quite hiding the way they whispered. Whispered about the Duke, whispered about his wife, and whispered, most of all, about the woman standing beside him who was not his wife. Lady Seraphina Blackthorn stood alone near the tall arched window at the far end of the east corridor. She wore deep navy silk, her dark chestnut hair pinned carefully with small pearl clips, her silver-blue eyes watching the snow fall silently outside. She was not dancing. She had not danced all evening, not because no one had asked. A baron had offered his hand twice. A young lord had smiled at her from across the room, but Seraphina was not looking for anyone else. She was looking for her husband. She told herself it was simply to say good night, to stand beside him for just a moment so the court would not talk. She told herself she no longer hoped for more than that. But she was lying to herself, and somewhere deep in the quiet of her chest, she knew it. She moved through the corridor slowly, her gown trailing softly against the marble floor. Portraits of the Blackthorn ancestors watched from the walls, their painted eyes cold and proud, as if they had always known how this story would end. She passed the music room, the library, the private sitting room that had once been hers before the Duke quietly stopped inviting her to share it. Then she stopped. The door to his private study was not fully closed. A thin line of warm firelight spilled into the corridor. And through that narrow gap, she heard two voices. One she had loved for 3 years, one she had feared for nearly as long, laughter, high and bright and cruel. A woman like Seraphina was not built to be loved, Adrian. She was built to be endured. Seraphina's hand pressed flat against the wall beside the door. She did not breathe. She tries so hard, the Duke's voice said. Low, unbothered, faintly amused. It is almost sad. Almost? Lady Vivienne laughed again. It is completely sad. She writes you letters. Did you know that? Letters. As if she is your sweetheart and not your legal inconvenience. The fire crackled inside the study. Glass touched glass, wine being poured. She will never give the duchy an heir, Vivienne continued, her voice dropping lower, quieter, and somehow more dangerous for it. She has been here 3 years, Adrian, 3 years of failure. How much longer will you let her embarrass you? The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then, not much longer. The words landed against Seraphina like something physical. Like the cold outside had reached through the stone walls and pressed itself against her throat. Not much longer. She stepped back from the door. 1 step, then another. Her hand came up to cover her mouth, not to stop a sob she refused to sob in this corridor, in this house, for these people, but simply to keep herself from making any sound at all. Because if she made a sound, they would open the door, and she could not let them see her face. Not now. Not with what she was carrying. Her other hand moved. Slowly, gently, pressing against the lower fold of her gown just below her waist. The physician's letter was tucked beneath her bodice. She had read it 4 times since receiving it that morning. She had sat in her private chamber with the door locked, reading it over and over, not quite believing the words. She was with child. The very heir said she could never give him. She had spent hours imagining how she would tell him, whether she would say it quietly, over dinner, or wait until they were alone, or perhaps write it in one of those letters Vivienne so enjoyed mocking. She had imagined the surprise on his face. She had imagined, just for a small, foolish moment, that it might change something. Now she stood in the corridor of Blackthorn Manor, listening to her husband call her a legal inconvenience. And she understood, completely, and finally, that nothing would ever change. Seraphina walked away from the door. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked the length of the corridor, with her spine straight and her chin level, the way her mother had taught her, because a Vale woman did not collapse in hallways no matter what she heard. But inside her chest, something was quietly, permanently breaking. By midnight, the masquerade was still in full celebration. By midnight, the snow outside had thickened, and by midnight, Lady Seraphina Blackthorn had made a decision. She was leaving. Tonight. And she was taking the heir of Blackthorn with her. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. 3 years earlier, Seraphina Vale arrived at Blackthorn Manor on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, riding in a carriage that smelled of leather and lavender water, wearing a dress of deep green that her mother had said made her look composed. She was 22 years old. She was terrified, and she was determined not to show it. The marriage had been arranged between her father, Lord Edmund Vale, and the Duke's family council 6 months prior. She had met Adrian Blackthorn exactly twice before the wedding. Both times he had been polite in the way that expensive furniture is polite, beautiful, cold, and entirely unreachable. He was 31. He had inherited the duchy at 19 after his father's sudden death. He had built it into one of the most powerful noble houses in the kingdom through a combination of ruthless intelligence, careful alliances, and a reputation that made other aristocrats speak his name carefully, as if the wrong tone might bring consequences. The women in court called him dangerous and breathtaking in the same breath. The men called him untouchable. No one, in either camp, had thought to call him kind. But Seraphina had told herself she could be patient. She had told herself that coldness was not cruelty, that distance was not hatred, and that marriages could grow into warmth, the way fires grew from small sparks, if you simply gave them enough time. She had been young enough to believe that. The first year of the marriage had been quiet. Adrian was busy. He was always busy. There were councils and trade negotiations and visits to Parliament and dinners with lords, whose names Seraphina had to memorize quickly if she did not want to embarrass herself. He had given her a suite of rooms on the East Wing. He had assigned her a staff. He had introduced her at court with the appropriate formality. He had never once asked her what she enjoyed reading. He had never asked her what she feared. He had never stayed long enough in any room she occupied to learn that she laughed quickly, cried privately, and had a way of noticing small, beautiful things, the way light moved across stone, the color of the sky, just before a storm that might have moved him, had he ever been still long enough to see it. By the second year, the court had begun to whisper. No child yet, no warmth between them in public, and then, appearing at balls and dinners and theatre evenings, Lady Vivienne Ashcroft. Vivienne was everything that Seraphina, by the court's measure, was not. Where Seraphina was quiet, Vivienne was brilliant. Where Seraphina was gentle, Vivienne was sharp. where Seraphina dressed in navy and forest green and soft silver, Vivienne wore crimson. Always crimson, as if she was daring anyone to look away. No one did. Seraphina had watched from a careful distance for months before she allowed herself to name what she was seeing. She had made every excuse a loyal and hopeful wife could make. Old friends, political necessity, simple social courtesy. But there was nothing courteous about the way Vivienne touched Adrian's arm in public, or the way he did not step back when she did. Clara Whitmore, Seraphina's maid and the one person in the manor she trusted fully, had been the one to finally say the quiet thing out loud. "My lady," Clara had said one evening, helping Seraphina remove her earrings after a dinner at which Vivienne had sat 3 seats closer to the Duke than etiquette required. "You do not have to pretend with me." Seraphina had looked at her own reflection in the mirror for a long time. "I am not pretending," she had said finally. "I am surviving." She had thought there was dignity in that. She had not yet understood that there is a difference between surviving and disappearing. She had been disappearing, one quiet month at a time, without ever noticing it happening. By the 3rd year, the noble women of court had stopped asking Seraphina about children with any genuine curiosity. They asked the way people ask about a wound they know has not healed, not because they want it to heal, but because the asking reminds everyone in the room that the wound is there. Still no news, Lady Blackthorn. Lady Eloise Harrington had asked at a garden luncheon, just 3 weeks before the masquerade ball, her eyes already sliding toward Vivienne across the terrace, before the question was fully out of her mouth. Seraphina had smiled. She had learned to smile at things that should have made her cry. "Not as yet," she had said pleasantly. "But the season is still young." Polite laughter. Polite subject change. And Seraphina had sat very still for the rest of the luncheon, watching bees move lazily through the late roses, and had quietly, steadily reminded herself that her worth was not a number counted in nursery rooms. She was not certain she believed it, but she kept saying it. The morning before the masquerade, the physician's visit had been routine. A quarterly check. Seraphina had expected nothing from it except an hour of polite medical conversation and the usual gentle reminder to rest more and worry less. She had not expected Dr. Fenwick to go quiet for a moment in the middle of writing his notes, and then look up at her with a careful, cautious expression. "My lady," he had said, setting down his pen, "I believe I have some news that will require you to sit down if you are not already." She had already been sitting. She sat more completely. He had placed the letter in her hands himself, sealed with his practiced seal, the words written in his neat, precise hand. She had read it 3 times before the words became real. Then she had thanked him with perfect composure, waited until he left the room, and pressed both her hands flat against the surface of the writing desk, breathing slowly until her vision steadied. A child, his child, their child, growing quietly, secretly, impossibly, in a marriage that had seemed to have nothing left to grow. She had sat with the letter all morning. She had thought about the future, about what this meant, about how she would say it, and when, and whether it would change something between them. She had let herself hope, just for those few quiet morning hours, in a way she had forbidden herself to hope for a very long time. Then she had put on her navy gown for the masquerade, tucked the letter beneath her bodice, and gone down to the ball. and she had walked to her husband's study, and she had heard everything. Seraphina did not go back to the ballroom. She went to her rooms. Clara was there, as she always was, tidying the dressing table with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent years learning to be useful without being intrusive. She looked up when Seraphina entered. She saw the expression on her face. She closed the bedroom door. "What happened?" Seraphina did not answer immediately. She crossed the room to the window and stood there looking at the snow. It was falling thickly now, the kind of snowfall that covered everything by morning, that made the world look clean and new and said nothing about the cold underneath. "I am leaving tonight," Seraphina said. Her voice was steady. She had made the decision, and the decision had made her steady. "I need your help, Clara." Clara did not gasp. She did not argue. She was 26 years old, and she had been with Seraphina since before the marriage, and she understood Seraphina's silences better than most people understood each other's words. She looked at the window, then at Seraphina's face, then at the hand that Seraphina had placed unconsciously against her stomach. Her eyes went soft. "How far along?" Clara asked quietly. Even now, even here, Seraphina felt something warm move through her at the question. Not joy. Joy was a complicated word night, but something tender, the recognition that what she was carrying was real. 8 weeks, perhaps 9. The physician confirmed it this morning. Clara nodded, once, decisively. She moved to the wardrobe without another word, and began pulling out plain dark, traveling clothes, a wool dress the color of charcoal, a heavy cloak, sturdy gloves, things that would not draw attention, things designed for movement, not for courts. "I have £40 saved," Clara said, folding quickly. "It is yours." "I cannot take your savings, Clara. You can and you will. My savings are yours. I am yours, if you'll have me." Seraphina turned from the window. There were no tears in her eyes. She had decided, in the corridor outside that study, that she would cry when she was safe. Not before. Tears belonged to people who had the luxury of feeling their feelings without consequence. She did not have that luxury yet. "You would come with me, my lady?" Clara looked at her plainly. "Where else would I go?" They worked quickly and quietly. Seraphina took only what she could carry in a single traveling bag: a change of clothes, her grandmother's ring, which had been hers before the marriage, and therefore remained hers, the Seasonster, the physician's letter, a small amount of her own household pin money she had been setting aside for months, without quite knowing why. The instincts of a woman who has lived in uncertainty long enough to prepare for it, without fully admitting she is doing so. She took nothing with the Blackthorn crest. Not the jewels he had given her, not the fur-lined cloaks he had provided, not the silk gloves or the pearl earrings or any of the dozen beautiful things that had been given to her as decorations instead of as affection. She left her wedding ring on the writing desk. She did not write a note. What would she say? "I heard you. I heard every word. I am taking your heir and my dignity, and I am going somewhere. You cannot reduce me to a legal inconvenience. I am choosing my child over your title. I am choosing myself." None of it would fit in a note, and he did not deserve the explanation. They went out through the servants' corridor on the lower east wing. Clara had done this before, not for escapes, but for early morning market trips, for quiet errands, and she knew which door the night footman checked and which one he did not. They slipped out into the snow without being seen. The cold hit immediately. Dense and sharp, the kind that made the inside of your nose ache and turned your breath visible. The snow was up to their ankles already and coming down harder. Seraphina did not look back at the manor. She walked forward. They reached the main road half a mile from the manor gates, where Clara had quietly arranged, earlier that day on a different kind of errand, for a hired carriage from the village inn to be waiting. The driver was a man named Henry Birch, round-faced and incurious, who asked no questions because Clara had paid him enough that questions seemed unwise. They climbed in. The carriage moved, and for the first time since she had stood outside that study door, Seraphina allowed herself to stop performing composure and simply breathe. The snow hammered softly against the carriage windows. The village lights flickered past and then disappeared. The road ahead was dark and white and entirely unknown. Seraphina pressed her hand against her stomach and felt very clearly for the first time the full weight of what she was doing. She was leaving everything she had known for 3 years. A title, a house, a husband who had never chosen her, not even once. She was going into a world with 40 pounds, a faithful maid, and a pregnancy she had not yet decided how to explain. She was also, she realized slowly, more completely herself at this moment than she had been in years. Fear had a strange way of doing that, of stripping everything away until you found out what was actually left underneath. What was left underneath was a woman who loved the child she had not yet met, who refused to raise that child in a house full of contempt, and who was, for the first time in a very long time, making a decision that no one else had made for her. Clara reached across into the darkness and took her hand. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that the darkness did not already understand. Duke Adrian Blackthorn returned to the East Wing at 1:30 in the morning. The masquerade was still running. Music still drifted from the ballroom. A group of lords was loudly losing at cards in the billiard room. Someone was laughing very loudly near the staircase. Adrian walked past all of it. He was not drunk. He rarely drank to excess. Excess was a form of losing control, and Adrian Blackthorn did not lose control. He was simply tired. Tired in the quiet, bone-deep way of a man who has spent too long performing a version of himself that he does not entirely respect. He knocked on Seraphina's door out of habit, because had an unwritten rule that he checked her rooms before retiring, a habit that had grown from duty and remained from something he had never examined closely enough to name. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He opened the door. The room was dark. The candles had burned low, and at the center of the dressing table, small and gold and catching what little light remained, sat her wedding ring. He stood in the doorway for a long time. His expression did not change, because it was a trained expression, built over years of managing what people could see. But something shifted behind his gray eyes. Something that, had anyone been there to observe it, might have looked a great deal like the very first breath of a panic he did not yet understand. He told himself she had simply gone to stay with a friend. Some minor falling out, a dramatic gesture. She would be back. He told himself this clearly and firmly, the way he told himself all things, and then he went to his own rooms and stood at his window for a very long time, watching the snow fall over the grounds. Below, the tracks from the east wing door had already been covered. The snow erased everything. quickly, completely, as if she had simply ceased to exist. The town of Whitbarrow sat at the edge of the sea, the way a person sits at the edge of a decision not committed, not retreating, simply existing in that uncertain space between one thing and the next. It was not a beautiful town, but it was a true one. The houses were stone and salt-worn. The fishermen rose before dawn and came home smelling of brine. The market women knew everyone's business and shared it freely. There were no masks here, no grand corridors, no portraits watching you from walls. Seraphina had chosen it because no one who knew her name would ever think to look for her here. She had arrived as Mrs. Sarah Ward, a widow, recently bereaved, traveling with her maid for a rest by the sea as her late husband's physician had recommended. Clara had helped her build the story carefully, filling in the details that made it believable. The late husband had been a modest country gentleman, not poor but not grand, which was why Sarah Ward dressed plainly and did not throw money around and attracted no particular notice. The widow at the edge of town, the landlady said, with the quiet eyes. That was all anyone knew of her. That was all anyone needed to know. The rooms she had rented above a bakery on the sea road were small and warm. The smell of bread was there every morning when she woke, a small daily kindness that she had not expected and was absurdly grateful for. Clara slept in the adjacent room. They had settled into a routine with the ease of people who have always been closer to family than to employer and employee. In those first weeks, Seraphina slept a great deal. The pregnancy pulled at her energy in ways she had not anticipated, and the emotional weight of everything she had left behind compounded the exhaustion. She slept, and she woke, and she ate what Clara brought, and she watched the sea from the window. And she did not think about Adrian Blackthorn if she could help it. When she could not help it, she thought about him in clinical terms. She catalogued what he was, not what she had hoped he might become. She reminded herself, over and over, of the exact tone of his voice, when he had said not much longer, not angry, not regretful, just faintly tired, as if she were a problem he had been waiting to resolve. She catalogued that. She kept it close, because the version of herself that had waited 3 years for him to see her was soft in a way she could no longer afford to be. By the 4th week, Seraphina began going to the market herself. Clara had done it alone at first, not wanting to expose Seraphina to unnecessary contact with people who might ask questions. But Seraphina had grown restless in a way that had nothing to do with impatience, and everything to do with realizing that she had spent 3 years being managed, and she was not going to spend this new chapter being managed either, even gently, even lovingly. She went to the market. She learned prices. She learned which stall sold the best fish, and which one sold fish that had been sitting too long. She learned to bargain something no one had taught her, because duchesses did not bargain. And she found, to her genuine surprise, that she was good at it. She made small, careful connections. The baker's wife, Margaret, who had 5 children and laughed at everything and gave Seraphina extra rolls because, she said, a woman with a baby coming needed extra rolls. The old fisherman, Thomas, who nodded at her every morning from his doorstep, and eventually began telling her which days would bring storms. A girl named Poppy, who sold ribbons, and had a way of talking that Seraphina of no one she had ever known, which was its own sort of gift. She learned that she could exist without the Blackthorn name, This felt initially terrifying. Then, gradually, extraordinary. She had spent her whole life being someone's daughter, then someone's wife, then someone's duchess. She had not known until now, in a market town where no one knew any of those words attached to her name, what she herself actually was. She was a woman who noticed the color of the morning sky. She was a woman who made friends with fishermen and bakers. She was a woman who was going to have a son, she felt, without explanation, that he was a son, and who was going to raise him to know that his value did not depend on whether someone else chose him. That last thought surprised her with its fierceness. Her grandmother's lawyer had found her in the 3rd week, not through any failure in her disguise, but because she had written to him herself carefully from a post office in the next town under her own maiden name, citing the clause in her grandmother's estate documents that she had read quietly in her own library 6 months ago. Her grandmother, the formidable Lady Rose Vale, who had died 2 years before the marriage, had left an inheritance in trust for Seraphina with the provision that it could be claimed independently if Seraphina was ever living separate from her husband. Her grandmother had been the kind of woman who planned for things she hoped would never happen. The inheritance was substantial. Not vast, but substantial. Enough to live in genuine comfort. Enough to never depend on anyone's charity. Enough to give her son a real start. Seraphina had read the lawyer's letter in her small, warm room above the bakery, with the sea wind coming through the cracked window, and she had felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Safe. Adrian found the physician's letter on the 12th day. He had gone through Seraphina's rooms a second time, more carefully, not in search of letters or evidence, he told himself, but simply to ensure that nothing of value had been left behind. He had already sent 3 discreet inquiries to her family home, to no avail. Lord Vale had written back a cold, brief note saying he did not know where his daughter was, which Adrian had found impossible to believe, but could not prove was a lie. The physician's letter was in the lining of an old jewelry box he had nearly overlooked. She had hidden it there, or left it there in her haste, he would never know which, and it fell out when he lifted the box lid, and the lining slipped. He read it once. Then he sat down on the edge of her bed and read it again. A child. She had been carrying his child the night of the masquerade. She had been walking toward his study, perhaps to tell him. And instead, she had heard. He stood up very quickly and crossed to the window. The grounds below were white and still. The winter had settled in completely. Somewhere beyond those gates, in some direction he did not know, his wife was alone and pregnant in the middle of winter. The thought did something to him that he could not immediately classify. It was not comfortable. It was not the measured concern of a man managing a political situation. It was the sharp, ugly feeling of a man who is beginning to understand what he has done. "Graves," he said, when his chancellor appeared in the doorway. "I need her found. I do not care what it costs. I do not care who knows we are looking. Find her." Chancellor Theodore Graves looked at the Duke, at the unusual set of his jaw, at the physician's letter still in his hand, and said, only what a man who had known Adrian since boyhood could say at such a moment. "You should have found her 3 years ago, sir, before she had reason to run." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. He did not deny it. The men who met in Lord Cedric Ashbourne's private library on that cold January night did not light many candles. This was intentional. Some conversations were better held in near darkness, where no one had to look anyone else too directly in the eye. Cedric Ashbourne was a large man with a wide face and small eyes that watched everything and expressed nothing. He was 53 years old and had spent those years accumulating influence, the way some men accumulated art, methodically, patiently, with an eye toward long-term value rather than immediate beauty. He had wanted the Blackthorn duchy for 20 years. Not the title, not the land specifically, though the land was considerable. He wanted the trade routes that ran through the duchy's harbour. He wanted the political seat on the Northern Council that came with it. He wanted the leverage. He had tried 3 times to broker a financial partnership with the previous Duke. He had tried twice with Adrian. Every time, Adrian had closed the door with cold finality. Cedric had begun to understand that the only way into the Blackthorn legacy was around the current Duke, not through him. Vivienne Ashcroft sat near the cold fireplace, with her hands folded in her lap and her green eyes very still. She was his cousin. That was the connection most people knew. No one in court knew the other part, that she had been working for him for 4 years, that her relationship with Adrian had been cultivated with specific intent, that the warmth she showed the Duke had always had an architectural purpose behind it. She was not without her own feelings in the matter. Vivienne was too complex a person to be entirely mercenary. But her feelings and her purpose had always been arranged, so that one served the other neatly, and she had never allowed sentiment to compromise the structure. "She has disappeared entirely," Vivienne said. Her voice was even. 3 months gone, and none of the Duke's people haven't even a thread. "The child is the problem," Cedric said. He said it without drama, the way you state a weather forecast. "If she produces a legitimate heir, the duchy is locked. My entire framework requires the line to be questioned or broken." "She will produce the heir," Vivienne said. "She is somewhere safe, and she is healthy, and she has money of her own. I made the mistake of underestimating her endurance." A third man in the corner, thin, quietly dressed, with the kind of face that was easy to forget, looked up. "Then the solution is straightforward," he said. "The woman and the child cannot both survive the birth." Vivienne went very still. Even she, for a moment, felt the coldness of that sentence. Then she looked back at the dark window and said nothing, because she had made her choices long before this room, and it was too late to unmake them now. Seraphina did not know about Lord Ashbourne. She did not know about Vivienne's other allegiances, or the meeting in the dark library, or the thin man with the forgettable face who said something unforgivable in a quiet voice. What she knew was that on a Tuesday morning in late January, she looked up from the market stall where she was buying dried herbs and saw a man she did not recognize watching her from across the square. He was not doing anything threatening. He was just standing there, but there was a quality to his watching a stillness, a slight angle of his head that made something old and animal in her go quiet and alert. She bought her herbs. She did not look at him again. She walked home through the back lanes. She told Clara that evening. A watcher, Clara said. She was folding clothes with focused, careful movements. Not local. I don't think so. His boots were city boots, and he was not there for the market. Clara set down the clothes and looked at Seraphina directly. The Duke? Perhaps. Or someone who wants to find the Duke's heir, for reasons that have nothing to do with affection. They sat quietly for a moment with the weight of that between them. "We should move," Clara said. "Not yet. Moving quickly could draw more attention than staying carefully. I need to think." She thought for 3 days. She watched the square from her window with the careful patience of a woman who had learned in the last 3 months that observation was a form of power. The watcher came back once more. Then he was gone, but Seraphina understood now that the quiet was not permanent. She had a duchy's worth of inheritance growing inside her, and there were people in the world for whom that was not a thing to celebrate. She had come here to disappear. She was going to have to learn, instead, to be both invisible and ready. He arrived on a Thursday, riding a horse that looked like it, had travelled fast and far, and was not pleased about either. Sebastian Vale was 30, broad-shouldered with the same dark chestnut colouring as his cousin, and the kind of blunt manner that had always made him less popular in court than he deserved. He had never been close to the aristocratic centre of things. He lived on a modest country estate, managed his own affairs, and had always found the performance of nobility somewhat exhausting. He had also always been devoted to Seraphina, not romantically, but with the steady, undemonstrative loyalty of a person who has simply decided, at some point, that someone else matters and has not reconsidered since. He had tracked her through a combination of family knowledge, careful inquiry, and the fact that Seraphina, for all her intelligence, had written her grandmother's lawyer from a post office, 2 towns, overusing her maiden name, and Sebastian had thought to ask that lawyer a very direct question. When she opened the door and found him standing on the step in his travel coat, still smelling of cold air and horse, she stared at him for a moment. Then she stepped aside to let him in. "How bad is it?" he asked, without preamble. He looked at her pregnancy more visible, now, at nearly 4 months, and then at her face, and then back at her. "Someone watched me in the market 3 days ago," she said. "I don't know who sent them." "I have some ideas," Sebastian said. He sat down heavily at the small kitchen table and rubbed his face. "Seraphina, there is a faction moving against the duchy, against the heir specifically. I heard rumors in the capital last week, and I rode here directly. You are not as hidden as you think." The room was very still, the fire crackled, the sea moved outside. Not much longer, Adrian had said, about her. She had made peace with being unwanted. She had not made peace with her child being hunted. "Tell me everything," she said. "Leave nothing out." The search for Seraphina had consumed Adrian in a way nothing else had ever managed. He was not a man who was accustomed to losing things. He had never lost an argument in Parliament, never lost a trade negotiation, never lost a financial wager that he had set his mind to carefully. He possessed, in great abundance, the particular arrogance of someone to whom competence has always come easily. This was different. She was not a negotiation. She was not a wager. And the more time passed without finding her, the more clearly he began to understand that the absence of Seraphina from the manor was not simply a problem to be solved. It was a consequence of something specific. And he had spent 4 months refusing to look at it directly. He found the letters in March. He had asked one of Seraphina's former maids, not Clara, who had vanished with her, but the second maid, a girl named Agnes, if she knew of any personal items that had been left behind in storage. Agnes had mentioned, hesitantly, a small cedar chest in the back of the dressing room, closet that had always been private, that Seraphina kept herself. The chest was locked. Adrian broke it open. Inside were letters, 43 of them, by his eventual count, written in Seraphina's precise, careful handwriting, dated over the course of their 3-year marriage. Each one addressed to him. None of them sent. He sat on the floor of her dressing room, the Duke of Blackthorn, feared negotiator, powerful lord, sitting cross-legged on his wife's dressing room floor, and he read them, all 43. From the first month of their marriage, I am trying to learn the shape of you. I believe you are not unkind, only armored, and I am patient. I can be patient if you will let me try. From the 8th month, you looked at me tonight during the dinner, and for just a moment, I thought you were about to say something. Something real. But then Lord Harrington spoke, and the moment closed. I saved a seat for you, later in the music room. You didn't come. I played the piano for an hour by myself, and pretended I had planned it that way. From the 2nd year, they asked me again today about children. I smiled and changed the subject. What they do not understand is that I am not afraid of being childless. I am afraid of the reason for it. I am afraid that you already know who you would rather this family be built with. And you are simply waiting for the right moment to arrange it. Please tell me I am wrong. Please find me tonight and tell me I am imagining things. I will believe you. I am ready to believe you. From the 3rd year, I do not think you are a cruel man. I think you are a man who was never taught that the people closest to you were allowed to matter. I think someone, your father, perhaps, this cold place, taught you that caring was weakness, and so you built your life around demonstrating that you did not care. I understand that. I even grieve it for you. But Adrian, I am running out of the kind of hope that survives understanding. From 2 weeks before the masquerade, I wonder sometimes if you would notice if I simply stopped. Stopped trying. Stopped hoping. Stopped leaving small signs around the house that I am here, and I am watching, and I would like, very much, for you to see me. I wonder if you would even feel the absence. Adrian read that 3 times. He set it down on the floor very carefully, as if it were fragile. His hands, he noticed distantly, were not quite steady. He would notice. He was noticing now. He had been noticing for 4 months in the specific, agonizing way of a man who has lost something and is only beginning to calculate its full worth in its absence. He had told himself this was about the heir, the political complications, the responsibility. He was responsible, wasn't he, for what happened to her, for the child, for the security of the inheritance. But sitting on the floor of her empty dressing room, surrounded by 43 letters she had never sent him, he could not find the political framing for what he was feeling. It just felt like grief. Theodore Graves found him there an hour later. He took in the scene, the broken cedar chest, the letters, the Duke on the floor, and said nothing for a moment. Then he sat down on the small dressing-room stool, the way a man who has decided something uncomfortable needs to be said will sometimes first find somewhere physically stable to say it from. I knew about Lady Ashcroft's family connections to Lord Ashbourne, he said. I learned it 4 months ago. I did not tell you because, he paused, because I was not certain you would receive the information well, given your involvement with her. Adrian looked at him. Tell me now, he said. His voice was quiet in a way that was not quiet at all. Graves told him. All of it. The trade route agenda. The 20-year campaign. the suspicion growing stronger through the capital's networks that someone had begun to actively hunt for the location of the Blackthorn heir. Adrian was on his feet before Graves finished the sentence. "Where is she?" Adrian's voice was controlled, but only barely. "You have better intelligence networks than any man in this kingdom. Where is she?" "Whitbarrow," Graves said carefully. "Coastal province. She arrived as a widow named Sarah Ward. She has a cousin with her now, Sebastian Vale, who rode there 2 weeks ago. And so he stood, there is a man named Harker. Thin man, quiet face. He was seen in Whitbarrow a month ago. He works for Ashbourne." Adrian was already at the door. "Get my horse," he said. "Get it now." The warning came at dusk. A boy from the docks, 12 years old, serious face, 3 copper coins in his fist that Sebastian had given him the week before, with instructions to come immediately if he saw certain kinds of strangers. In the harbour, came hammering on the bakery door as the sun was turning the sea copper gold. 3 men, he said breathlessly. Before Sebastian had even fully opened the door, city coats, asking the innkeeper about a widow woman with a maid. The innkeeper sent them away, but one of them stayed watching the main road. Sebastian looked back at Seraphina over his shoulder. She was sitting at the kitchen table. 7 months along now, her belly round and clear under her wool dress, her silver-blue eyes very still as she processed the news. She did not panic. She had spent the last 3 months preparing for exactly this. "The old cathedral," she said. "The abandoned one at the North Headland. We discussed it. It is 3 miles in the dark. Sebastian." Her voice was steady. "I can walk 3 miles. Clara was already moving. A traveling bag already packed. It had been packed for 2 weeks. The emergency money sewn into the lining of Seraphina's cloak. The physician's materials that the local doctor had helped her stock. They went out the back, through the alley, up the coastal path that wound along the cliff edge in the dark. The wind was sharp and smelled of rain coming. Seraphina walked with one hand on her belly and one hand on Sebastian's arm. And she did not look at the drop to the right, only at the path ahead. St. Saldrick's Cathedral had been abandoned for 30 years. A structural problem in the East Wing had been deemed too expensive to repair, and the congregation had relocated to a newer building in town. The old cathedral sat on the headland, half reclaimed by coastal weeds and salt wind, its great stone arches still standing, its interior gutted of furnishings, but cathedral-shaped. Still in all the ways that mattered. It was cold, and it was draughty, and it smelled of rain and old stone. But the walls were thick, and there was only one entrance road, and Sebastian had surveyed it twice. They arrived at 8:30. Sebastian lit a small lantern low, directed inward, not visible from the road. Clara arranged their traveling things in the corner behind what had once been the altar. Seraphina sat on a stone that had once been part of a pew foundation and breathed through the dull, persistent ache in her lower back that had been growing since morning. "Not yet," she told the child, with the irrational directness of a woman in late pregnancy who had begun speaking to her son, as if he could already hear. "Not yet. Give me a little more time." They waited. An hour passed. 2. The rain began, and then the cathedral door, which Sebastian had wedged shut, opened. There were 2 of them. Not 3, 2, which meant the third was likely still watching the coast road. The thin man with the quiet face, Harker, was one of them. He carried a lantern in one hand and something metallic in the other. The second man was larger and moved, with the practiced stillness of someone for whom threats were professional rather than personal. Sebastian stepped forward, positioning himself between them and Seraphina without drama, the way a man does when he has already made peace with the possibility of being hurt. "You have the wrong place," he said. "We have exactly the right place," Harker said. His voice was light, even pleasant. "The widow from the bakery. We only want to speak with her. No cause for concern." Seraphina stood. She had decided in the 2 hours of waiting that she was done being small in the presence of people who wanted to make her smaller. Her back was screaming, and her hands were shaking faintly, and her son was pressing against her ribs with a frequency that suggested he was either very uncomfortable or very agitated, and possibly both. She stood up anyway. "You work for Lord Ashbourne," she said clearly, "and Lord Ashbourne wants the Blackthorn heir removed. Which means you are not here to speak with me." Harker's pleasant expression did not change. He took a step forward. Sebastian moved. The lantern went over. In an abandoned cathedral, with 30 years of dust and dried coastal weeds and old timber in the rotted pew bases, a tipped lantern was not a minor incident. The fire took the east corner in seconds. Adrian had been riding since dawn. He had changed horses twice. He had pushed through rain and dark roads and a stretch of coastal path that had been treacherous in the wet. He had arrived in Whitbarrow at 9 in the evening to find the bakery empty and a dock boy who, for 2 more copper coins, pointed him north. He smelled the smoke before he saw it, and then he saw the orange light flickering at the headland against the dark sky, and he was off the horse before it had properly stopped, running across the wet grass toward the cathedral, with his coat open, and his heart hammering with a ferocity that had nothing political or measured about it at all. He went through the side entrance. The main door was blocked by a fallen, burning beam ducking low where the smoke was worst, calling her name. "Seraphina!" The large man came out of the smoke at him. They collided hard. Adrian took a blow to the shoulder that made his whole arm go numb. He fought back with the cold efficiency of a man who had been trained in youth by a military father who believed every nobleman should know how to fight without a weapon. And he put the man down and kept moving. He found her in the corner behind the old altar. Sebastian had his back to the burning section of the east wall, shielding her, his coat smoking at the sleeve. Clara was beside them, and Seraphina. Seraphina was on the ground. She was breathing. She was conscious. Her silver-blue eyes found his immediately when he dropped down beside her. Her expression was not what he had expected. It was not relief, or fear, or even anger, though all those things were there beneath the surface. It was the expression of a woman who is looking at something she has thought about for a very long time and is finally prepared to say. "Adrian," she said, and even now, even here, in a burning building, on a stone floor, her voice was steady. "What took you so long?" He got her out. He carried her when she couldn't move quickly enough through the smoke. And he did not ask if he was allowed to, and she did not protest. Sebastian held Clara close, and they moved together through the side passage, bending low beneath the rolling black smoke, while the east wall collapsed behind them in a burst of heat and light and sound like the world itself rearranging. They came out into the rain. The rain was extraordinary. cold and immediate and real. Seraphina pressed her face into Adrian's neck and felt the rain and the cold and solidity of someone holding her, and breathed once, deeply. Then the pain came, real this time, not the dull ache of the last 2 months, the sharp, specific, unmistakable pain of a body that had decided, after everything, that now was the time. "Adrian," she said quietly into his collar. "I have you," he said, already moving away from the fire. "No, Adrian, the baby is coming." He stopped. He looked at her, and for the first time in 4 years of knowing this man, through every ball and council meeting and cold corridor, through every silence and every absence, she saw something in his face that she had never seen there before. Terror, completely unguarded and entirely human. "Clara," he started. "I know," Clara said, already moving. "Get her to the shelter house now." The shelter house was a stone fisherman's cottage 1/4 mile from the cathedral, used in storms, by men caught out on the headland. It was small and cold and smelled of salt and rope. Clara had it warm and lit within 15 minutes through some combination of preparation and sheer determined competence that Seraphina, in the later years of telling this story, would describe as the most useful thing she had ever witnessed. Sebastian took up a position outside the door. Clara took charge of the room. Adrian sat beside Seraphina and held her hand without being asked, and did not let go. It was a long night. The rain came down without stopping. The fire at the cathedral died. Slowly on the headland they could see the glow fading through the one small window. The third man from Ashbourne's group had disappeared into the dark. Sebastian found evidence of a fast retreat toward the harbour. Harker himself had not come out of the cathedral. None of that mattered in the cottage. In the cottage, there was only this room, and this fire, and this woman, and this night. At some point during the long hours, when the worst of it was past, and they were simply waiting with the particular focused patience of people who understand they have no power over what comes next. Adrian spoke, not loudly, not with any particular intention toward eloquence. Simply, quietly, into the low-lit room. "I read your letters," he said. Seraphina's eyes were closed. Her breathing was controlled and deliberate. "All of them," he said. 43. I found the cedar chest." A pause. "I was going to burn them," she said, without opening her eyes. "Several times. I never quite managed to. I am glad you didn't." She did not answer that. She was not ready yet to let those words matter. She had let his words matter for 3 years, and she had learned what that cost. But she did not pull her hand away. The child was born just before 4 in the morning. He arrived with the particular furious insistence of someone who has made very clear in the last 12 hours that he will not be delayed for anyone's convenience. He was small 2 months early, by Clara's careful reckoning, and he made the exact sound that a child who is breathing and alive and furious about the temperature makes, and Clara wrapped him and put him in Seraphina's arms, with the satisfied expression of someone who has managed something genuinely difficult, and knows it. Seraphina looked at his face, silver-blue eyes, her eyes in an impossibly small face. Dark hair already, damp and fine. She understood, completely and immediately, every decision she had made in the last 5 months. Every cold night, every false name, every careful step away from comfort toward the self she had needed to become. She would do it again. She would do it 100 times. He was worth every single piece of it. She looked up. Adrian was sitting across the room, and he was looking at the child, the way a man looks at something that has rearranged. In a single moment, everything he thought he understood about what mattered. His face was entirely open. She had never seen it like that. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Seraphina said, "You should know his name is Elias. I decided that 3 months ago." Adrian nodded slowly. His throat moved. "Elias," he repeated, like he was learning the shape of the word, like he was trying to understand all the things contained in it. Another long silence. Then, "I need to say something," Adrian said. "I need to say it now, before you decide anything else about me, because I think I have not had enough words for long enough. And it has cost us both in ways I am still working out the size of." Seraphina looked at him. Her arms were full of Elias, who was making small, disgruntled sounds against her chest. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. "What she said that night," he said slowly, "was not wrong in its description of what I had allowed. I allowed it, not because I believed it, I did not believe it, but because I was comfortable with the distance. And I chose my comfort over your dignity, and that is a specific kind of failure that I do not have a good defense for." Seraphina did not speak. "Your letters? The one where you said you were running out of hope. I read that, and I understood that I had been given something, a person who was patient and real, and who chose to stay, and I had decided, without ever examining the decision, that it would simply be there, that you would simply always be there. I did not think about what it would cost you to stay." She looked at Elias's face, then at Adrian's. "I know," she said, quietly, without bitterness, because she was too tired for bitterness, and because bitterness required a kind of energy that she preferred to save for things that deserved it. "I know you did not mean to destroy things. That is not actually the comfort you think it is. Carelessness and cruelty arrive at the same place." "Yes," he said. He did not flinch from it. "Yes, that's exactly right." She watched him absorb that. She watched him not argue with it, or soften it, or redirect it. She watched a man who had spent his entire life managing every situation he walked into simply sit with the full weight of being wrong. It did not fix anything. It did not last 3 years. But it was, she thought, the first real thing he had ever said to her. "What happens now," she said, "depends entirely on you continuing to do that. Being honest, choosing plainness over performance. I am not capable of returning to what we were. I don't think you are capable of it either. I think it would kill something in both of us that is finally beginning to breathe." "I am not asking you to return to what we were," he said. "I am asking you to tell me what you need, and I will listen. This time, I will actually listen." Elias made a small, imperious sound, as if to register his opinion on the proceedings. Both of them looked at him, and for the first time in 4 years, Seraphina and Adrian Blackthorn laughed at the same moment, at the same thing, genuinely and without arrangement. It was small, it was brief, but it was real. Lord Cedric Ashbourne was arrested 2 weeks later. The evidence against him, gathered over months by Graves' network and confirmed by Harker's own deposition, secured in exchange for leniency, was sufficient for the Crown to strip his titles and his trade licenses and send him to face charges before the Northern Council. Vivienne Ashcroft left the country. Adrian did not pursue her. He had looked at the full picture of what she had been, and felt, more than anything, a profound tiredness. Whatever she had meant to him had been constructed on architecture that collapsed the moment its hidden frame was visible. He found he had no grief for it, which told him a great deal about what it had actually been. Seraphina did not return to Blackthorn Manor immediately. She stayed in Whitbarrow for 2 months more, until Elias was strong enough to travel. And she was strong enough to have the conversation she needed to have with herself about what returning meant. She returned on her own terms, with her own money in her own name, with Sebastian and Clara accompanying her, with the full knowledge that she could leave again if she chose. This was important. Not leaving because you are trapped is different from choosing to stay. She needed the choice to be real. The manor was different when she returned, though she could not have said immediately what had changed. It was the same marble corridors, the same portraits, the same amber candlelight, but Adrian had done something in her absence that she only fully understood later. He had removed every portrait from her corridor, all the cold Blackthorn ancestors watching. He had replaced them with a clean wall. She had stood in that corridor for a long time. "I thought you might prefer to choose what goes there," he had said, from behind her. She had turned to find him holding Elias, which he had become, in Whitbarrow and on the road home, quite competent at, in the tentative and over-careful way of a man who is terrified of dropping something important. She had looked at that picture, this cold, armored man, holding this small, furious child with absolute careful concentration, and she had understood something about the distance between who people were and who they were capable of becoming. She did not forgive him that day. Forgiveness was not a single morning. But she opened the door a little. Not wide, just a little. A crack of light was still light. There are lessons in stories like this that belong to everyone who lives them. Seraphina's lesson was perhaps the most important, that patience without self-respect is not virtue. That enduring cruelty quietly is not strength, even when it looks like strength from the outside. That a woman who knows her own worth does not need someone else to confirm it, but knowing your worth may require you to first walk away from every place where it has been denied long enough for you to forget it. She had walked away in the snow with 40 pounds, and a pregnancy, and a faithful maid and found in a market town by the sea, that she was capable of things she had never been allowed to discover inside the walls of Blackthorn Manor. She was a woman who could survive, who could build, who could love fiercely without losing herself to the loving. Elias would grow up knowing that his mother was not defined by who his father had failed to be. Adrian's lesson was quieter and longer and less dramatic, the way the lessons that matter most usually are. He learned that being powerful enough that no one can reach you is not the same as being safe. He learned that the people who love you are not furniture in the house of your life, stable and reliable, and requiring nothing in return. He learned that silence in a marriage is not neutral. It communicates things you have not decided to say and may not have the courage to claim. He learned it the hard way, in a burning building in the rain, reading 43 letters from a woman who had loved him long enough to stop sending them. Clara and Sebastian, who saw all of this from close up and with clear eyes, drew their own conclusions. Clara concluded that loyalty well placed was its own kind of wealth. Sebastian concluded that the people worth riding 4 days for in the middle of winter were worth every cold mile. and Elias Blackthorn, who would grow up between a sea town and a great manor, between a mother who had walked through fire for him and a father who had learned, almost too late, what things were worth protecting. Elias grew up understanding something that his parents had each had to earn separately before they could give it to him. That being loved is not a performance, and home is not a place you are assigned. Home is the people who choose to be honest with you, even when it costs them something, especially then. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.